A new online poll from Angus Reid finds increasing support for Doug Ford despite mounting criticism over his government's performance on key issues. And for a closer look at this, we're joined live by Shachi Curl, president of the Angus Reid Institute. Shachi, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Bakari, thanks as always for having me.
Okay, so looking at this, right, 40% of Ontarians would vote for the PCs if an election were held today, but they're not exactly approving of the handling of, key issues. Connect the dots here.
Yeah, absolutely. So even in your setup, you talk about that support for Doug Ford. It's more like support for the PCPO in terms of vote intention, despite the fact that Ontarians across the political spectrum of all political stripes are pretty ticked off with the Ford government across a number of different measures of government performance. It's handling of the healthcare file, it's handling of public safety, of the opioid and toxic drug crisis, of poverty and homelessness, of cost of living and housing affordability. It goes on and on. The Ford government basically has net negative ratings across all of those things. And that's kind of nerd speak for basically saying more people think that the Ford government is doing a bad job on all of these files versus doing a good job. And what's really key was when you see just how high some of those net negative ratings are, they're pretty damning. It tells me, Bakari, that it's not just NDP supporters who are ticked off at the Ford government. It's not just Liberal supporters or Green supporters who are saying that the Ford government is doing a bad job, rather. When you're into like a minus 77, it means a significant number of your own voting group and your own support base thinks that you're not getting the job done. But of course, there's always a dissonance, right, between are you doing a good job or a bad job versus am I so annoyed about the bad job you're doing that I'm going to change my political stripe and go vote for another party? And that's where we see not only the Ontario Conservatives holding the amount of support that they have, they've actually gone up a couple points in spite of that perceived bad performance.
Okay, so Shachi, you touched on this a little bit. Let's talk about how the NDP and the Liberal parties compare here.
Well, right now, they're both in a dogfight for distant seconds. So if you look just at vote intention, the Ontario Conservatives are sitting at about 40% in terms of vote intention. They'll take that to the bank. But that is totally predicated on the fact that the left of center vote is split. It is split between the NDP at 25% vote intent and the Ontario Liberals at 23% vote intent. They're actually battling and really in third place by a couple of points, although we would call that a statistical tie between the NDP and the Liberals. The point is that the Conservatives are not only doubling their number in terms of vote intent over either of those left of center parties, but despite the fact that you've got new leaders in Bonnie Crombie and Marriott Stiles, you just don't have the momentum that they would like to have and like to see against the backdrop of a really unpopular government. So neither the NDP leader nor the Ontario Liberal leader are really setting the house on fire in terms of inspiring potential voters at this stage.
Okay, along with that, Shachi, those polls say that they don't know enough about the leaders. Can you elaborate on that? Is it knowing enough about the leaders or the policies? How does that translate here?
Well, definitely when you're a newer leader, it takes a little bit of time for people to get to know you personally. Like Doug Ford's a big personality, right? If you went out onto Queen Street and asked people, hey, give me 3 words for Doug Ford, love him or hate him, people are going to have things to say about him. It's not the same thing right now for Ms. Stiles or Ms. Crombie. Even though Ms. Crombie's been around Ontario politics for a long time, she is relatively unknown. So not only do voters not really have a sense of what makes their parties better or a better alternative than the Ontario Conservatives, they also really don't have a sense of who these leaders are, what they stand for, what their personalities are like, or if these are people they can warm up to. That does take some time. Sometimes it takes as long as until an election for people to get serious and really adjudicate who these leaders are. But it does speak to a massive gap in the need need for both the NDP and the Liberal leader to do, I think, clearly a much more effective job of trying to punch through and tell their story and give Ontarians a sense of who they are.
All right, Shachi Curl, president of the Angus Reid Institute, always a pleasure, and thank you.
Thanks for having me, Bakari.